we begin our program, I would like to inquire, is there anyone else? Strange faces. Maybe he's not strange, I just haven't seen him in a couple of years. And I don't look the way I did then. Now, are there any other visitors? Then we're all locked in for the night, and our speaker is going to enlighten us and entertain us. You all know Gordon McCann. His fascination with Missouri folklore, and particularly folk music, led him to an acquaintanceship with Vance Randolph, and he was the subject of Gordon's speech tonight. And Gordon finished just a few weeks ago a publication of the bibliography of Ozark folk song. Ozark folklore?
All right, you're close.
Okay.
You're close. Folk something, go ahead.
Yeah, bibliography. And it's the important thing. It's not a biography, it's a listing of publications. And we're delighted to have Gordon McCann speak to us tonight. Thank you.
I might enforce what Tom was saying to any of you, since we got a crowd here, a captive crowd here. On May the 13th, I think any of you that want to come will really enjoy this. The main entertainment is going to be some square dancers from Douglas County. Now, if any of you have not been in Douglas County, it is something to see. They are still back many, many years ago with their dancing, and it's very unique. Now, for about the first 10 minutes, you're just going to have to sit there and listen to this, because I know practically everybody in this room knows who Vance Randolph was, because most of you are from this town. And no matter what your opinions of him are, you still are aware that he wrote about the Ozarks and became one of the largest publishers of Ozarks material in the United States. So I'm going to very quickly go through, in about 10 minutes, the first 80 years of his life, to let you know how he arrived here, and to let you also know the number of years that this man devoted his life to writing about the Ozarks and the Ozarks culture. Vance was born February 23rd, 1892 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. His father was a lawyer there, and his mother was a school teacher before she married, and after her husband's death she became a librarian at the Pittsburgh Public Library for 25 years. Vance's first visit to the Ozarks was in 1899 at age 7. He accompanied his parents to Knoll, Missouri on the Elk River over in McDonald County in southeast Missouri. Of course, that's beautiful country over there. And they stayed for 2 weeks, and that set the stage for the next 81 years of his life. He wrote in a book in 1943 that was entitled Wild Stories from the Ozarks, and he said, "I was only 7 years old at the time, but I perceived at once that the Ozarks country was the garden spot of all creation." And he believed that all his life, just like we all do too. His early education and pre-graduate work was in Pittsburgh. In 1914, he received an A.B. and a B.S. in education from Pittsburgh State College. In 1915, he went away to Clark University at Worcester, Mass., and got an M.A. in psychology, and he studied under G. Stanley Hall while he was there. In 1916, he returned to Pittsburgh, taught biology in the high school, and at that age began writing a few commercial articles that were the first of what was to be his long career of writing. In 1918, he enlisted in the Army, and he served first at Camp Funston in Kansas and then to Camp Pike in Arkansas. And he contracted some illnesses there that he received a medical discharge, and that brief service proved invaluable to him in his later years when his illnesses got very serious. The number of times he mentioned to me that he had been more than rewarded for his valiant defense of Kansas and Arkansas. In 1919, he moved to Pineville, over on the Elk River, about 8 miles east of Knoll. He bought a house and began seriously becoming involved with the Ozarks. And he also started trying to struggle making a livelihood at writing. Well, he was not very successful. So in 1922, he went back to Lawrence, went to KU, to work until 1924 on a PhD in psychology. But while he was there, they had a series of talks and Carl Sandburg and Margaret Larkin. Margaret Larkin was another great collector of ballads. They both came for a long series of lectures and stayed for a while at Lawrence and got acquainted with Vance and became acquainted with the collecting of Ozarks ballads that he had already begun. And they encouraged him to the point that he abandoned his plans for the doctorate and returned back to Pineville. So with the exception of a few short trips away, he remained the rest of his life in the Ozarks. In 1930, at age 38, he married Marie Wilbur. Her father was a doctor at Pineville, and he had collected a number of ballads from her back in 1919. This was a pretty stormy relationship, but it lasted until her death in 1937. He had quite a problem with John Barleycorn about this time, and so his writing was pretty slow, but he took the Keeley cure, and he said he was never cured. He says, once you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic, but you just quit it, you know. And in 1931, he published his first major work on the Ozarks. It was called The Ozarks, An American Survival of a Primitive Culture. This was followed in 1932 by Ozark Mountain Folks, and in 1933 from an Ozark Holler. All these were published by Vanguard Press, which, just like today, was a big publishing house at that time. Now these three, and especially the first one, is what really caused the controversy in this part of the country. He was praised by one half of his readers and vilified by the others. And I still hear a lot of criticism of his early writings of the Ozark, but I always felt that in order to get something published at that time, you almost had to have kind of a Beverly Hillbilly element to your writing to get into the publisher. But in amongst all this writing in those first books was a lot of good hard facts and observations of the Ozarks people. He left about that time, about 1934, and he went to California to do script writing. Just quickly here, he got in Dory Sherry, who later became head of MGM out there. He and Dory Sherry had a script to write that was going to star, let's see, who was the tugboat? Who was the guy? The tugboat builder? Wallace Berry and Marie Dressler were the two. Well, Vance, one of the main points of Vance was his keen observation of dialect, so I know that whatever he wrote in dialect was right. Well, they worked on it, and they presented the script to this producer and waited, and about 4 weeks later he called him in and just threw it down the floor at him, and he says, it's not authentic enough. And the story goes, and Dory Sherry wrote this in a book called Haydig just before he died. The Vance just looked at him and said a bad word and spat right on the man's white rug and walked out and came back to the Ozarks. And Dory Sherry said years later, that same office, that stain was still on that rug. Well, when he got back, he started writing some fiction at this time too. He wrote Camp on Wildcat Creek in 1934. He wrote a book called Hedwig that was considered by some of his best fiction in 1935. Then in 1936 he did Camp Meeting Murders, which was in collaboration with a writer by the pseudonym of Nancy Clemens, who many of you know as Nance Shoemate, who lives over on North Douglas right now, or by the Nance Greenhouse. That's her family. In 1936, he also became assistant supervisor of the Writers' Projects in Missouri, which was a part of the WPA. And this way, he was still able to make a little bit of money and to continue writing even during the Depression. Now, in 1940, he moved to Galena, and he became more or less his base of operations for the next 6 years. And he lived for part of the time with Miss Fanny Mathis's boarding house at the west edge of town. And then he moved down with Jack Short and family, the big Short home there on the east side of above the railroad tracks in Galena. And of course, that's the Short family that produced Dewey Short. He was our congressman for 24 years. In 1941, he moved in with Rose O'Neill for a year. Rose and Callista and Clink. There's a story too. Rose, Callista, and Clink. But we won't get into that. At Bonnybrook over in Taney County. And he stayed there for almost a year, helping her rewrite her autobiography. Now, she had written it about 3 or 4 years before, and sent it to the publisher, and it had been rejected, been sent back. So she wanted Vance to help her rewrite her autobiography. So he stayed almost a year there, writing that. And then he left. And the story I've always heard was that before they sent it off again to the publisher, Callista got hold of it and blue penciled the heck out of it, because Rose must have really told some good stories. I always wished I could have seen that manuscript to see, but it came back again. Well, she called Vance to come help her again, and when he saw how eviscerated it had been, he wouldn't have anything else to do with it. Now, S of O has a, School of the Ozarks, has a manuscript down there. That's Rose's autobiography. But now here's the one Rose wrote, then Vance rewrote, Felicity Blue Pencil, and then I've heard at least 2 or 3 other people, a couple of them after Rose's death, have also worked that manuscript over, so there's no telling which one School of the Ozarks has, but that's the only one in existence. It'd be interesting for somebody to try and do something with it. Let's see. That page is out of the way. Now, all during the 30s and 40s, and there's going to be a lot of you remember this, he had been in and out of Springfield. In 1934, he had been active in helping Sarah Gertrude Knott from St. Louis, who, along with others in this region, such as May Kennedy McCord and Lucille Morris Upton, were busy organizing the first National Folk Festival that was to be held in St. Louis. They had had a bunch of tryouts at all the little towns, and then they all came to Springfield, and they had a final tryout there, and they selected a certain amount to go to St. Louis and represent this section of the state. Of course, they did this all over the state. Well, they had a banquet at the Kentwood, and it was to be held for all the organizers and the participants. It was to be a good time. Well, right in the middle of it, a very well-known businessman whom you all know got up and literally pulled Vance over the coals. And he said he was censuring him because he was one of the principal culprits who had been promoting all this awful hillbilly stuff for all the country to read about. And it would certainly be best for all if it were left alone and forgotten. We certainly don't want people in St. Louis to think we're like those pitiful folks in Arkansas. Now, you all know the attitude that still prevails, but really prevailed for a long time, at least in this part, in this state, about this old hillbilly stuff, you know. Well, Vance always remembered that the one person that came to his aid, stood up and defended him at that meeting, and then later in her column defended him, was Lucille Morris Upton. And when I was working with Vance a few years ago, why he had me give her a copy of his bibliography, the first one did, and he wrote a real nice inscription remembering how she had helped him and how much he appreciated it. It's always interesting to me that our Chamber of Commerce now presents visiting dignitaries with an honorary hillbilly award. In 1947, he moved to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and he would now live the rest of his life in Arkansas. And of course, in Eureka Springs, he came, at that time was quite a writers and artists colony, almost a bohemian type thing, and he also Otto Ernest Rayburn, another great writer about the Ozarks, was there at that time. Then he became active in the Ozark Folklore Society, which had been founded in 1949 by John Gould Fletcher, and through it became acquainted with the Society's secretary, Mary Celestia Parler. Mary was from South Carolina, and she'd been teaching at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville since 1948 in the English department, and had begun a folklore studies department, which she continued to teach until she retired. They were married in 1962, and Vance was 70 years old. And they lived in an apartment in Fayetteville until Vance's illness, serious problems, he was having physical problems, and Mary's failing eyesight forced them to move to a rest home just south of the campus. But they were great companions for each other the last 18 years of their marriage. Now I'd better stop a minute and explain how in the world I ever got involved with this. I have to sit down and think sometimes how in the world, if anybody told me 15 years ago I'd have been up here talking about Vance Randolph, I said, you're nuts, you know, how in the world? I just know who the man is. Well, we had a lot of things in common before we met. Like a lot of you, I've lived all my life in the Ozarks, never lived anywhere else. In fact, not long ago I was doing something and happened to trace back my mother's side, and my children are 7th generation Ozarks. Now that's a long way, long time to be living. And my father's people, through them I heard all the stories about the mines in Joplin, and about on Main Street, the House of Lords, which was across the street from the Connor. And Vance hung out there a lot when he was in Joplin. My mother was raised in Springdale, Arkansas, and her family were Buchanans and Beans and Earls and Good Pastors, all names familiar in that area of the Prairie Grove and Cane Hill and Fayetteville area. And I was literally raised on Northwest Arkansas history. I'd always liked reading, especially history. And as the years went by, I narrowed my interest down to the Ozarks region. And then when the centennial of the Civil War came, I really narrowed it down to the Trans-Mississippi area, and through somewhere or another, I drifted into folklore. I don't know how it is, and I became reacquainted with Vance Randolph. I'd known a little bit about it. I think I'd read a couple of his books then, but really no serious reading. But there were other circumstances that helped me have some groundwork with him and common interest and thing. My wife's from Clever, Missouri. Now that's over in the panhandle of western Christian County, and her mother was a Little. Now if you're a Little in Clever, Missouri, in that area, you're related to practically every human being within a radius of 50 miles. It's just, I never saw such a concentration. I always thought, you know, the Mormons are all coming down here because this is a traditional site of the Garden of Eden. And I wanted to tell one time, well, yeah, and I bet I'm the guy that knows Adam and Eve's last name. And I think it was Little, and they never left. They stayed and just begat more Littles, you know. But Vance knew this clan, and occasionally I had heard some of them speak of knowing him before I really became involved with him. And also my wife's closest friend was a Short. And so that's the family, of course, he lived with in Greene. Well, I was on the library board in Springfield at the time. Max Hunter donated his folk song collection. Now, Vance and Mary had been instrumental in encouraging Vance to continue his collecting and do more of it. And of course, when he finally turned it over to the Library of Congress and to a copy here, it's the largest regional folk song collection in the United States. And Max told me that Vance was in a rest home in Fayetteville, and that it was possible for me to visit him there. Well, at that time, I was one of those lucky people with 2 children in the university at the same time. And in 1975, I didn't know how that Easter was going to change my life, but we went down to visit our children, my son and daughter. And that day began with us, my son, taking us to the Methodist church that he had assured his mother he had been attending with some regularity since he had been there, you know. Well, we walked into the foyer, and of course, you can imagine, Easter Sunday, it was jammed with people. And we were next in line to be ushered to our seat when my wife, in conversation with the woman next to her, found out we were in the wrong church. Well, by then, it was a point of no return. I mean, we couldn't turn around and go back out and try and locate that Methodist church anyway. So we went ahead and sat down, but boy, he was as white as anybody I've ever seen, and his mother's looks in a church. I always felt sorry for him because he was only 2 blocks off. There was a Methodist church up on the hill in Fayetteville. Boy, that was a wild time there for a while. I think it was a Presbyterian church, so it really wasn't that bad, you know, but I can think where it could have been some problems. Well, anyway, things cooled down, and we all went out and had a good dinner. And after that, my son and daughter were going to take her around to see the homes in Fayetteville, and I thought, well, this is my chance to go out to the rest home and visit Vance and Mary. And I called ahead of time, and they said, come on out. Well, Sunrise Manor is like a lot of rest homes, just a lot of confusion and noise and all sorts of people walking around the halls, you know. Their room was about halfway down one of the main corridors, room 106. And when I walked in, it's a very small room, about the size of this right here, is about all it was, about 9 by 16, I think, or something. And Vance was, as I was to see him practically every time for the next almost 6 years, laying in bed with his head propped up on pillows, with books and papers all around him, and writing or reading, either writing in a tablet or reading. Mary's bed was over next to him here, and she was practically blind. But he was 83 at the time, and was practically bedridden from hip injuries he'd had, and heart condition he'd had, and arthritis. He was having serious problems with arthritis. Now, I'd been more or less conditioned that he would be very gruff, and I was very apprehensive how I would be received, because somebody said, oh, he's a gruff old boy. And I heard a lot of stories up here in Springfield about him, and that he'd all but throw you out of the room. Well, it wasn't that way at all. And with all these shared interests we had and people we knew, we got off to a good start, mainly because I was able to fill him in on a lot of people in Greene and Reed Springs and Springfield and everything that he hadn't heard of in years. Well, about that time, he was in the final stages of finishing proofreading and checking the book that was to really be the turning point in his life, even at 83. And in the interest of delicacy, I will say it's just a book of bawdy tales. And what do they call it when you take the first letters of each word in something? We're taking the first letter of each word in something, I guess. So we'll call it Pitts, P-I-T-S. And I'll refer to it that way. That's the way they called it. They called it Pitts. Well, he was in the final stages of getting ready to send it back to the University of Illinois. And we talked about that, and over the next few visits, we began to talk more and more about, he had published a bibliography in 1972. And many scholars consider it his best contribution to regional folklore. You seldom see annotated bibliographies folklore material. If they are, they just list the titles and nothing else. But this was all annotated, all with the opinions pro and con about the article and information about what's in this article or book or whatever. Well, the more we talked about that, the more we centered our conversation on the written word of the Ozarks. Now, I had quite a library at that time, and he had thought, you know, why keep on with it? It's about over with. Well, the reason was he had no access to material, unless Ernie Dean, who was his good friend down there, and I guess visited him more than anybody I know of. Ernie used to have an article in a column in our paper called Ozarks Country. That was a good article to read, good column to read. Unless he would come to see him and bring him something. Occasionally one of Mary's friends from the English department would bring him something. He had no access to many publications, and occasionally a folklore journal or something like that. Well, I took, the next time between visits, I took that copy of the 72 bibliography and went through my library and returned to him a list of 70 titles he didn't have. Well, that got him excited, and he said, well, loan me as much as you can and we'll get started on this thing. Well, that brings up, though, really kind of a point of this talk in a way, kind of a subtopic, kind of a sad situation that I think is far more common than we might realize. Here was this man whose mind was just as keen as it could be. I think this is one of the sharpest individuals I've ever worked with, except my wife. I gotta be careful. Anyway, he was in this rest home, and I think more or less people thought he had been put out to pasture. A lot of people probably thought he was already dead. In fact, Dory Sherry referred to him in an article he wrote as the late Vance Randolph, when Vance was still alive. He was always going to write him back and quote Mark Twain, you know. But I think he'd been just put out to pasture. And what upsets me, as much of a good time as I had with it and all that, I'm always sad to think of the graduate and pre-graduate and postgraduate students at that university that could have benefited from his knowledge. He was only 6 blocks from the University of Arkansas Library. And I always thought that was a sad state of affairs. Well, let's see. That got me started with him on this volume 2. I'll just show you. Here's the first volume here. It's been reprinted by University of Missouri Press. The first one was a paperback that was done by the University of Indiana Press. And this is a hardback that was done by University of Missouri Press. But I became his book runner, and I went to the libraries and anywhere I could and searched material for it and sent it to him. And then he would read it and review it. And we did this for, like I say, the next 6 years. And one thing that he began to realize that he hadn't realized was that there was such a renewed interest in nostalgia, in what we call old-timey. I heard some people not long ago said they'd never heard that term. Well, I've heard that all my life. Something's old-timey. It's old, you know. And so we started all these books. The thing to look for was, besides the book itself, would be down in the footnotes or something, because these people, it was marketable again, for one thing, besides being of interest, so more and more people were writing about it. And things, unusual things that helped promote this, one was the Waldens, Roots was another one, and as wild as it was, the Beverly Hillbillies actually caused a lot of people to be interested in this nostalgia and this old-time type of stuff. But we looked through all the footnotes and the bibliographies and all that, and we were amazed at the material that we turned up. The 72 bibliography, this one, has about 2,300 reviews, and Volume 2 ended up with 1,700. Of course, he didn't know this because it was finished after he passed away, but he knew we had a lot of material to work from. Now, I want to talk about Pitts again. As I said, I entered it in its final stages. Now, the reason this book came out as a book of bawdy materials, this material would have been spread out through no telling how many publications. But in the pre-70s, any bawdy material was blue penciled out of publications. It wasn't fit for public consumption. And I guess the 60s started to change to where all of a sudden, of course now I think it's gone overboard with some of the television movies and stuff. But all of this had been resting in the Delta file of the Library of Congress, which Vance had given them in 1954, which was all of his bawdy material. And so here comes this book of bawdy tales. And when it came out, many of Vance's friends that I knew in Springfield thought it was terrible. They thought it was a disgraceful thing to have a bunch of dirty stories. But a lot of people thought it was the funniest thing they ever read. And Vance was worried about it as being remembered as the author of a dirty book. And as it turned out, though, the first group, or the second group, I mean, maybe it must have had the upper hand, because it was a blessing in disguise for this man. Since it first came out in hardback in 1976, then right after that, University of Illinois put out a paperback edition, and then they later sold it to Bantam Books or somebody. It's gone through about 10 printings, and the last I heard, a couple of years ago, it sold almost 250,000 copies. It made more money before he died than all of his previous works put together. But it also helped him reawake a public interest in his work. Since Pitts came out in 1976, these are some of the things that happened to him. Before his death, the University of Missouri Press republished the 4-volume Ozark folk songs that had come out right at the end of the 40s and the first of the 50s, which is still the greatest work on Ozark ballads in print. One thing I want to talk about NU Press too, I thought was a nice thing. Vance had lost any kind of claim to royalties or anything on all the publications he'd ever done. And they didn't have to pay him anything, but they gave him a very nice gratuity when they published that book, and they were under no obligation to do so. At that time, before his death too, he was elected a fellow in the American Folklore Society. He was only the second non-PhD to ever be so honored. University of Oklahoma Press republished Down in the Holler, a gallery of Ozark speech, which is my favorite book on dialect. And Bob Cochran at the University of Arkansas did a little book here called For Love and for Money, which is an annotated bibliography. This is all the things that Vance wrote that they could find. Now, he wrote under a lot of pseudonyms and that type of thing, but what he turned out is just tremendous. After his death, the Ozarks Mountaineer reissued Wild Stories from the Ozarks under the title Vance Randolph in the Ozarks in 1981. In 1985, Cochran's biography of Randolph, I don't know if I brought it or not, yeah, came out called Vance Randolph in the Ozarks. That's 1981. And then finally in 1987, Ozark Folklore and Annotated Bibliography Volume 2 by Randolph and McCann. So you had a new generation that had met Vance Randolph. And boy, he started getting the mail in, and I heard many people talk about good old Vance and all that, and I thought, yeah, where were you if they didn't know him, but that's like, where were you when he needed you, But anyway, so much for that. Now, what was so significant about Vance Randolph's activities in the field of folklore study? At the time he began his serious study of the Ozarks, the folklore techniques were completely different than what they wanted than we know nowadays. Most of the work by prominent folklorists was concerned with subjects that were looked upon as glamorous or mysterious, like Indian legends or ancient ballads and that type of thing. There was more interest in the collecting of the text of these myths and ballads than there was any interest in the people that were singing them or telling them. There was just no interest in the people themselves. Bill McNeil, at the Arkansas folklorist, said that folklorists were little concerned with informants, as they saw folklore mainly as a means to arriving at historical information. There was little regard for what we call today folk life. So here comes Randolph, who not only begins to study and record all aspects of a people and their culture. See, one of the things he was criticized for as far as the ballads were, that he didn't just record what they call the child's ballads. This is a list of ballads that were collected by an English folklorist as being over 400 years old or something. He collected everything. He collected popular music of the time, religious tunes, I don't know, all types, anything they were singing, he collected. And of course, the other thing was that he moved in with them and literally became one of them, instead of what I heard one scholar call one time hit and run scholarship, where you run in, you stay 4 weeks with the people, then you go back and write about them as if you knew everything about them. And he was aided by his wife as having the seeingest eyes and the hearingest ears she'd ever known. And I think he almost had total recall, because he could remember almost to the page on some book he hadn't read for probably 40 years. I thought he had his library hidden away somewhere at first. I thought, well, where's he getting all this information? And as it was just in his mind. But though not a part of the academic world of folklorists, his work is acknowledged as being among those that changed the study of folklore for years to come. And his collections still rank among the most vital and important in existence. Now, Vance had always hoped that he would work right up to the very last. Just H.L. Mencken, who started out being kind of an enemy of his because of what he said about the Ozarks, very derogatory. Then they became friends later on, and Mencken, after he saw the work that Randolph was doing, changed some of his opinions, and he just about did it. I saw him last, about a week before his death. He was in the intensive care unit at the Veterans Hospital in Fayetteville. And our last conversations were instructions to me about this volume 2 and how was Mary doing? Was she all right? He died November 1st, 1980 at age 88. Excuse me. He's buried in the cemetery, in the National Cemetery at Fayetteville. And when I picked up his belongings at the hospital, besides his personal effects, there was a copy of the Ozarks Mountaineer and a book on folklore essays that had been sent to him by his good friend Herbert Halpert, who's a noted folklorist now at St. John's Memorial University in Newfoundland. In December, Mary Randolph returned to Columbia, South Carolina to be close to her family, and she died the following September. Now, it all now, when it ended, you know, after working with him for 6 years and then worked another 3 years on this book and everything, and for some reason it seems like it's a long time ago. I don't know why that is. But I'll say one thing. For a brief time in my life, I really brushed elbows with a great mind. The thing that really amazed me about him was not just his knowledge and everything, but in spite of his handicaps. He'd used a typewriter all his life, and he was so arthritic in his hands that he had to hold a pen through like this to write. And yet I've got about 4 notebooks this thick of correspondence he sent me. It was just amazing. Vance was without doubt the greatest folklorist the Ozarks will ever know, and one of the greatest regionalists this country has ever had. Thank God Vance Randolph took that 2-week fishing trip with his parents to Knoll in 1889. But for his meticulous observation and his dedication to collect and record every bit of information about the Ozarks people, a way of life would have been lost, for it can never exist again. We all know that. I surely wish all of you who had an interest in these hills and the people in these hills could have had the opportunity I experienced knowing Vance Randolph. Thank you.
Barton, we thank you very much. And if you would not object, would there be any questions or comments?
I have a comment. The Missouri Review, Historic Review, has quite an article.
Oh, yeah, the last issue on that boy. He used to be at school in the Ozarks. I heard him give a talk one time. Mm-hmm. They've got quite a collection up there in their Missouri of photographs.
And it's pointed out that there's always something that happens. The academic area in the beginning they criticized and laid down.
Well, they would accept
he was posing pictures, putting people in pictures for, you know. That's it. It's mentioned in the article. I mean, it gives you a good.
Well, of course, it wasn't until the only reason that first Indiana Press printed that first bibliography because there was a folklorist that was head of their department, and they had a fund there for a certain series of publications, and he got Vance in on that. And when NU went to, they thought, well, they published, this is the supplement here, this is volume 2 right here, and when they thought, well, we'll publish the first one with it, which was fine, and they couldn't even find anybody at the University of Indiana that knew where the proofs were or knew where, they didn't have a copy of it. And finally, I gave them an extra copy I had, and they tore that apart and made some corrections and everything. But does anybody remember Vance or any remarks about any opinions of him? Because, boy, I heard some people really play him down. I mean, for what those first books, when I went back and read those, the first one especially, it wasn't what I expected, because the Vance Randolph I knew was more dialect and ballads and lifestyles and everything, and they're almost kind of Beverly Hillbillish in a way. But I figure he had to do that, or Vanguard Press would never have printed the things. I think those first 3 were in that era. That's what they wanted. Was that kind of? Sure, it was a commercial thing. Yeah.
I've got it.
Yeah. Yes.
Were he and May Kennedy McCord contemporaries? Were they acquainted?
Well, she was older, but oh yeah, he told me one time he remembered one of the most vivid memories he had is he and May went down here to Ozark to a square dance, and they danced all night. And when they left, the sun was coming up in the east. You know, he got a lot of information from her. He got a lot of information from Jack Short and from Bess Allman, of course, Jack Short's sister. Boy, she was a ton of information down there. In fact, all those Shorts that had stayed there were. And Greene is the fun stories I hear about him. Some I could tell, and some I won't. But yes.
Gordon, is it true that one of Vance's activities was to go around in these hills and holler with an old-fashioned tape recorder type thing?
Well, what he did when he got on the WPA stuff. No, let's see. After that, right towards the end of that, he never got a grant. He never got any money from the government to do anything. But what he did get from them, they sent him down a battery-operated recorder. Thing must have weighed 300 pounds. They had to have a cart to carry the thing around, and it operated off a car battery. And he couldn't drive very well, so usually he'd have somebody take him. And then he began taping these people, of course, with the old wax discs with the cactus needles, you know, cactus point needles. And all those things are at the Library of Congress now. Before that, he would go hear about it, then he'd run back to his room and write it down. And I never did know how much he knew to write note music, but I think he must have had some basic, just like you would in a hymnal or a church hymnal, you know, or something. In fact, J. Frank Short told me when he was a young boy or a young man at the Short house, his most vivid remembrance of Vance, his room was up on the second floor on the south side, was his typewriter going at all hours of the night. Because he'd go out and do these things and he'd run back and type it all down, you know.
We will thank Gordon once again for this very interesting and entertaining presentation, and declare the meeting of the Historical Society adjourned. We'll see you next month. Same place.
It's hard to
They can take it.
talk about a person sometimes.
Thank you, Gordon.
Why, thank you.
I just appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, you didn't